Hello. The patron video this week is on Paul and his call to be an apostle to the Gentiles. So we just finished this week in our reading through Acts chapter 22. And I'm a little surprised when I get to the end of Acts 22. Paul tells about going into the temple when he went to Jerusalem after his conversion and having this vision of God sending him to the Gentiles. Because I don't read about this experience clearly anywhere in Paul's writings, and this is the first time in Acts. All of a sudden, we're almost done with Acts. We have 6 more chapters to finish up Acts, and suddenly, while Paul is talking to a mob in Jerusalem that thinks that he's taken a Gentile into the temple, he says, "Look, God's the one that sent me on this mission to the Gentiles. And guess what? I first received that call while I was seeing a vision in the temple when I had first become a Christian. About the year 36 would have been when it would be." And it's like, whoa, where did this come from? I hadn't heard this before. And so I thought, okay, well, that's what we can do this week for our patron video. Let's look at Paul's call as an apostle to the Gentiles. Now, of course, we just don't know everything. And I do think that sometimes Acts syncopates things or combines things, puts things in a pleasing way, in a way that makes Acts is beautiful. I want to make it very clear. I think Acts is spectacular. And I think that it was acceptable for ancient historians to kind of present things in a way that had a certain artistry to it. History isn't always artistic. What I mean by that is there are little currents and eddies and little side things going over here. I took a course in European history when I was in high school, and it was just really hard to keep things straight. I like to have an organized overview of things with my mind. And I remember that whenever I've taken a history course, it's difficult to do that because there's so much stuff going on in so many different places at the same time. And one of the things that I appreciate about Luke Acts is that I think that Acts has, and of course he's inspired, but I believe on a human level, the book of Acts is beautiful. It is presented so smoothly and so clearly. And it would have been acceptable for Luke to smooth some things out, combine some things, stretch some things out in order to get it, even move some things around to get that to come out that way. I'm not making any accusation. I'm just simply saying that's in the back of my mind as a possibility. So let's go ahead and dive into some of the things that Paul and Acts say about his calling to the Gentiles. Well, first of all, let's go to Galatians 1. In Galatians 1 and 2, Paul tells the story of how the Lord first called him. I call it a conversion. I don't mean that Paul changed religions when I say that. I do think that he changed the sect to which he belonged. He was a Pharisee prior to this time. I don't think he was a Pharisee after this time. I think he was part of the Jesus movement, part of the way, joined the way at this point. So here's the verse where he says, "When God, who had set me apart before I was born and called me through his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son in me so that I might proclaim him among the Gentiles. I did not confer with any human being, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who are already apostles before me, but I went away at once into Arabia, and afterwards I returned into Damascus." So certainly in retrospect, Paul understands his call to be the Gentiles, to be foreordained by God, for God to have planned this before the creation of the world, I think Paul would say. And so Paul saw himself clearly. You know, when you ask Paul, what's your spiritual gift say? What's your calling in life? What's God called you to do? It's clear that at least by the time of Galatians here, that Paul understood himself to be sent by God to proclaim the resurrection of Christ and salvation to the Gentiles. Okay? When is Galatians written? Different people have different opinions. Probably on the evangelical spectrum, the year 49 is very popular. I personally date Galatians to maybe the mid-50s, maybe about 54, 53, 54, not too much difference in time. So we can say that by that time period, the late 40s and 50s, Paul's understanding of himself as apostle to the Gentile And I would agree. By 49, I think Paul pretty much understands that God is calling him to the Gentiles. I might see a little bit clarity coming in the events around 49, but here we have it. That by the early 50s at least, Paul understands God's calling on him to the Gentiles. Maybe before then. Well, let's push before then. Now, this event took place about the year 36. So Paul's been a believer for about 3 years. Paul did not go to, according to Galatians, Paul did not go to Jerusalem immediately when he believed on Jesus, but he spent about 3 years up north in the area of Damascus, including a time in Arabia. Now, what is Arabia? Arabia, I think, pretty clearly is the Nabatean kingdom, which is just to the east of Damascus. And the Nabatean kingdom is under King Aretas. I have a hunch that Paul ticks someone off there because the Arab ethnarch under King Aretas stands at the gate of Damascus waiting to arrest Paul. So Paul must have ticked someone off in Arabia when he was there, but he escapes down in a basket through a window in the wall and escapes from this Arab ethnarch. By the way, we can see the tendency of Acts here because Acts indicates the Jews are out to get Paul. But Paul himself says it was the Arabs under King Aretas that were out to get him. This fits with Acts. Acts emphasize the Jewish opposition to Paul, and in my estimation, downplays the Gentile and especially Roman opposition to Paul, which we know must have been significant also. And so the question arises: what could Paul have done in Arabia to tick off King Aretas and such? Well, one of the things that comes to mind is perhaps he was preaching in a Jonah kind of way. Maybe he was saying, the judgment is coming, fire will rain down upon your cities if you do not repent. That's possible. Now, what would that have looked like? Would Paul have had a full sense of them being able to be justified by faith? I'm not sure if Paul's sense of justification was fully cooked yet at this point. Could have been. But when I read Galatians 2, and I didn't put Galatians 2 in this video, when I see Paul this took place about the year 49, when Paul had his blow up at Antioch over Jewish and Gentile believers eating together. You read about that event at the last part of Galatians 2. I kind of feel like God used that conflict between him and Peter over whether Jewish and Gentile believers can freely eat together without the Gentiles doing certain purity concerns. I kind of feel like God may have used that event to cook justification by faith in the mature form that it would take in Paul's later ministry. And so, again, I can't prove any of this. I want to come up with what's true, but it seems to me that I don't think Paul would have had a full sense of justification by faith. Maybe at this point when he's it may be in some kind of incipient or developing form, maybe. But I could see Paul. Okay, here's what I could see happening. So Paul came to Damascus to arrest Christians, and then he becomes one. And so that couldn't have sat well with some of the Jewish leaders in Damascus, probably. So I can see Paul having to leave town. And where's he going to go? He can't go back down to Jerusalem because, they'd be even more opposed to him there because he was working for the leaders of the city there. And so, he heads east. He gets out of Dodge. He leaves the Roman Empire, as it were, crosses the line, goes into the Nabatean kingdom. Well, what's he going to do while he's there? Well, obviously he's trying to sort some stuff out because he's just taken a 180-degree turn in his understanding. He's praying, he's seeking the Lord, he's reading the scriptures. But hey, when you're in town, Paul's guy. He got to preach. I got to preach. If there was YouTube, Paul would be on YouTube. I have no question. If YouTube had existed in Paul's day, he would have been on YouTube preaching all the time. He'd have been on Facebook. He'd have been on Twitter. He'd have had a blog. Paul would have been blasting out there, gospel, 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 gospel. I'm convinced of it. And so when Paul's in the Nabatean kingdom, he's going to preach. Now, what's he going to preach? Well, he might preach a Jonah kind of message. I can see him saying that, repent or you're going to fry. and that's going to get you in trouble. Now, if he was doing something like that, it suggests that he would have already seen the possibility of salvation for Gentiles. And of course, there were God-fearers in all the synagogues of the diaspora. And by the way, there would have surely been synagogues in the Nabatean kingdom also. So it's possible that he went to those synagogues in the Nabatean kingdom, and that it created great conflict there, and that's what got the Arabs involved, for him creating a disturbance. So it does seem like he wouldn't have had to have been doing a Jonah kind of thing. He could have simply been seeking out the synagogues in Arabia. But okay, big question marks. We just don't know the answers. I don't know that we'll ever know the answers to some of these questions. So Paul ends up, so he can't go back to Arabia. He can't stay in Damascus. He can't stay in Jerusalem. So he goes back home to Tarsus. And for the next 8 years, my hunch has been, I've mentioned this in my videos, that Paul probably didn't just evangelize the synagogues of Cilicia. He probably went north also into Cappadocia, I would guess. I mean, that's 8 years. Paul never stays 8 years anywhere in the book of Acts. So I have a feeling he must have probably gone up. He's crossing off the X's of the places he's preached the gospel going north. I don't know whether he went all the way north, to the Black, is it the Black Sea? Did he go up into Pontus? I don't know. But Paul, I bet, is preaching the gospel in these regions for these 8 years. And how much would he be involved with Gentiles? That's a good question. Because as I just said, there are plenty of synagogues. There's synagogues in Arabia. There's synagogues in Cappadocia. So he may still be in an incipient form, not fully focusing on the Gentiles these years. Well, let's flip to the book of Acts for a second. The book of Acts, and again, I can think of good reasons for Luke to want to focus on Peter, because one of the tendencies of the book of Acts is to show that they did everything decently and in order, and that people followed authority. This kind of following of authority and orderliness would have been very attractive to a Roman, which Theophilus may be a Roman. And so it makes sense that the book of Acts would highlight Peter as the one who crosses that gate into the Gentile territory. This would have been in the late 30s. Now, from everything that Paul says, Paul certainly did not associate Peter with any mission to the Gentiles. Paul has no sense of Peter as an apostle to the Gentiles. And so it seems to me that it's at least possible that Acts is emphasizing this Peter and Cornelius event in a way that was disproportionate to the way it would have been experienced by your ordinary person at the time. The real start, it seems to me that even in the book of Acts, the real start of the mission to the Gentiles happens on the island of Cyprus in about the year 46. So Paul and Barnabas and John Mark, they've gone to Cyprus not to evangelize Gentiles, but to evangelize Jews. They go across the island, and Sergius Paulus, the Roman proconsul, seems to believe this. Again, I'm speculating a little bit, but it's like, ding, a light goes off in Paul's head here. This is where the book of Acts switches from calling him Saul to Paul. This is where Paul really begins to embrace his Roman identity, maybe. Could it be that it's this event with Sergius Paulus that really switch, Paul suddenly sees Gentiles. This is going to be about Gentiles. This is what God has called me to. God has called me to bring the gospel not to Jews, but to the non-Jews, to the Gentiles. And for Paul, who's an entrepreneur and an apostle, he's a outside the box thinker. He's a planter. He says in Romans 15, God has not called me to plant where other people have planted. He's called me to plant where other people haven't planted. And all of a sudden, Paul sees the whole world. The whole world is my parish. The whole world needs the gospel. I really wonder if the real turning point, the ding moment more than any other moment, and again, I'm not saying he hasn't been talking to Gentiles here and there up to this point, but it seems like maybe God used him being dragged before the proconsul. You think that you're putting me on trial, but what God is doing here is he is solidifying the deal of the gospel going to all the Gentiles. And so this seems to be a possible turning point. The change of plans. Guess what, Barnabas? Let's not go back to Antioch. Let's head north. Let's go to Galatia. That seems to be a significant turning point. Nevertheless, the book of Acts continues to portray going to the Jews as Paul's first order of business. I think this is strategic, of course. Of course, you're going to go to the synagogue first when you come to a new town. But it seems to me that Paul clearly did not understand himself as primarily an apostle to the Gentiles, as we'll see in the next slide. And so Acts does mention a number of turnings. Here's the couple that I remembered. I think those are the two turnings, where basically in the book of Acts, Paul says, my own people have rejected their own Messiah. I'm going to the non-Jews because they'll hear. And this is, of course, the mystery of Romans 9 through 11. Why is it the Jews have believed? Why is it the non-Jews have believed, who aren't God's people, and the Jews who are God's people haven't believed? This is a mystery to Paul. He doesn't understand it. Now, what about this calling vision we just had this week, where he has a vision in the temple? The book of Acts puts this around 36 in terms of the storyline, where Paul seems to see, well, I've thought about this and trying to fit it, because this is a surprise, right? Trying to fit it with all the other things that we've seen up to this point. I wonder if what Paul had a vision of is, I'm sending you to the whole world. I wonder if that's kind of the nutshell of what this vision that Paul had said. The vision of Paul was, I'm sending you to the whole world. And it might be that what all that entailed wasn't fully understood at that time. In hindsight, when Paul said, my destiny is as apostle of the Gentiles, that he could look back on that initial calling and say, you know what, when God was calling me to go to the whole world back when I had that vision, I understand now he was really calling me to go to the Gentiles. Again, I'm just hypothesizing here. I mentioned in my video, I think 2 days ago, the fourth video of Acts 22, that this vision he has reminds me of something he mentions in 2 Corinthians 12 about being taken up into the third heaven. It's tempting to try to combine those two events, but if we take both of the chronologies literally, they don't combine. But again, in history writing, there is some moving around, and there's some symbolism in numbers. So it's, I don't know what to do with it, but I'm just going to, that thought always crosses my head. Okay, Paul's sense of identity. What was Paul's sense of identity? My final slide for today. He sees himself as the apostle to the Gentiles. This is Romans 11. I'm speaking to you Gentiles. I think the book of Romans was primarily written to Gentiles, I think. I'm speaking to you Gentiles inasmuch as I am apostle to the Gentiles. I've written to you rather boldly, later on in Romans, by way of reminder, because of the grace given me by God to be a minister of Christ Jesus to the Gentiles. And then in Galatians, Peter and James and John saw that I'd been entrusted with the gospel for the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been entrusted with the gospel for the circumcised. For he who worked through Peter, making him apostle of the circumcised, also worked through me in sending me to the Gentiles. So it's very clear, Paul does not in any way see Peter associated with the Gentile mission. In fact, he'd kind of laugh at you probably. Peter, Gentiles, good grief. You remember what he did at Antioch? But Paul sees his destiny and his mission and his calling as the one that God, more than anybody else, has called to be apostle to the Gentiles. And the fact that we have 13 letters from Paul in the New Testament suggests that he was right. So there you have it. Paul's and his calling to the Gentiles. Again, I can't prove it. I hope I won't die for it. I don't know the answer, but my sense is that when Paul came to Christ, he realized that keeping the Jewish law was not what God was looking for. He'd kept the law pretty well. He said blamelessly in Philippians 3:6. So Paul must have thought, okay, God's not looking for law keeping. because if that's what he was looking for, I'd have been okay. He must be looking for Christ. I know the solution now. Now I've got to figure out, because if Christ is a solution, then my theology of what God's looking for has to be wrong. So Paul begins to process it. What is God looking for? What is God looking for? And then he has this vision where God sends him to the whole world. Okay, I'm going to the whole world. The whole world is my parish. This is my mission. This is my calling in life. And then on the island of Cyprus, wow, a Roman proconsul believed. Gentiles will believe. This is what God must have meant when he sent me into the whole world. I'm sent to the Gentiles. I'm apostle to the Gentiles. Come on, Barnabas, Mark, let's go north to Galatia. And then he gets back to Antioch, and we have this blow up over whether Jewish and Gentiles, and ding, it's justification by faith, people. God's not looking for law keeping at all to get us right with him. What God's looking for is the faithful death of Jesus Christ and our faith in God and what he's done through Christ. And then it's all over. Paul and Barnabas, they have their argument. They go their separate ways, which opens the door. You meant it for ill, but God meant it for good. Not exactly, but basically now it's wide open. Second missionary journey begins. Justification by faith is in place. The world is open for business, and Paul's gone, the apostle to the Gentiles. Well, speculation, a little bit of speculation, but hey, we like speculation. It's what we do every Sunday when we preach, right? To some extent, but hopefully we always preach a core truth that's certain as well. Well, this has been Paul and his sense of mission to the Gentiles.